All right, today is June 2nd. It is currently, I do believe, 1:17. I am here interviewing,
Audrey Ina Shaw.
and today we're going to be talking about, well, this is for my final project, so we're going to be focusing on a little bit of Great Migration, but mostly on the week of redlining, Black culture, and I forget the third name, but basically I'm just going to be, yeah, we're just going to be talking about mostly Black culture in LA. So, how long have you been in LA?
I've been in LA 72 years.
That's a long time. It's a very long time. Would you say you're the first generation of your family to be here? Like the first generation to be born here?
Yes, I'm the first generation to be born here.
So where is your family originally from?
My father is originally from New Orleans, Louisiana. My mother is from Muncie, Indiana.
Do you know the years that they moved out here? Like, do you know when they migrated out here?
Yes, um, my father was in World War II, and um, he was in the Navy, so he his main station, I guess, or his port was in San Diego. So after World War II, he came to San Diego. Then he went back to New Orleans um, to determine where he was going to live and what he was going to do. And so he was in New Orleans maybe a year or so, and he determined that he wanted to bring his mother uh, back to either San Diego or Los Angeles, where he thought there was less segregation. Um, I didn't find that out until I was 68, 69 years old. I did not know that there was any segregation in New Orleans until I found out that he came here because there was too much prejudice in New Orleans. So he came out in 1940, 46, 45, 46, end of 45, or no, 46. He came out in 46. And then my mother, she came out earlier than that. My mother was previously married to a very abusive man, and his father was a doctor. He had beat her up so many times that the final time that he had beat her up and put her in the hospital, her father-in-law came to her and said, "You cannot stay here because you will be killed. He will kill you." So the father-in-law gave her money and sent her to Los Angeles, where she had two or three older brothers living here. And that was in 40, 44, 45.
Oh, so you would say about like for both of them about like a 5-10 year period before you were born that they moved here?
No, more like yeah, more like a 5 year, 5 or 6 year.
Because what year were you born again?
1952.
1952, and they got here around the mid to late 40s.
Late 40s.
Late
yes.
40s.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So, would you say? Actually, I want to ask this. So, do you know what part of LA they first moved into, and then, because this is a two-part question, really. Do you know what part of LA they first moved into, and then, would you say that is the same part of LA that you were born into, or was there kind of like I'm asking if there's moving around? So, like, what part of LA did they move into first?
When my mother came here, she moved in with her second or third oldest brother and his wife, and they lived what we would call now South Central.
Oh,
Okay, no, further south. They lived closer. She lived closer to Imperial and Imperial and near Central.
So you would say more towards Inglewood?
Oh, past Inglewood.
Past Inglewood? You would say
Yeah.
further past Inglewood?
Yeah.
That's very south. That's
Yeah.
very south.
And then my father moved with three of his childhood friends from New Orleans. They were in the Navy together. They served together. And they decided to come out here together. So all of them came out here and they moved on Central Avenue in an apartment on Central Avenue.
Oh. Would you, because that's not the part of, because I assume that's not the part of LA that you grew up in. So
No.
what part of LA did you grow up in?
I grew in what is now called Jefferson Park.
Jefferson?
Park. I grew up between Arlington and Crenshaw and between Jefferson and Exposition.
And would you say that that's anywhere close to the original location of where your parents first moved in?
No.
Do you know how they ended up moving into Jefferson Park at all?
Yes. They were dating because my mother's hairdresser my mother's best friend hairdresser had a shop on Central Avenue, and my father was living on Central Avenue, and then my mother's brother, who she was living with, he was working with my father, so it was 2 or 3 ways because he lived on Central Avenue, and she used to go to the hairdresser on Central Avenue, and her brother and my father worked together in the construction industry.
Oh, would you say? Actually, that is I want to ask this again because I wanted to know how they fully ended up in Jefferson Park.
Oh, how they fully ended up in Jefferson Park is after they were dating. They dated for not too long. They dated, and then my mother became pregnant, and they wanted to find a house. They didn't want to live in an apartment. So they found a house, a nice home in Jefferson Park, right on the corner of 36th and 5th Avenue. And my father had saved up enough money to put a down payment on the house.
Oh.
And so he went to buy the house, and they wouldn't sell it to him because my father is a brown skin, not dark, but a brown skin, and he was obviously black. So they wouldn't sell it to him because they had a covenant on the house, which a lot of people don't realize, that Los Angeles had a lot of covenants that you can't sell to black, you couldn't sell to Asians, and you couldn't sell to Latins, Hispanics. You couldn't sell to any minority. You had to sell to white. So he couldn't get the house. They both liked the house. So my mother, who was pregnant, she was very fair, fairer than me, and she passed for white. So she went to the house and gave the owner cash money, and he sold her the house. And what was interesting was that she was pregnant. She did not have a job, but because she was so-called white, or he thought she was white, he sold her the house.
So the house that you grew up in and the house that later your descendants grew up in almost didn't end up becoming part of your house because they almost didn't sell it to y'all.
Correct.
Well, then that goes into my next question. I'm going to start shifting into more questions about you. So then, would you, growing up, what was the concentration of race within your neighborhood? Like, was it primarily black? Was it, actually no? Let me restart. Actually, what was the concentration? What was the race concentration of when they first moved in, and then what do you remember the race concentration being like when you were growing up?
Okay, when they first moved into the house, there were a lot. There were several, not a lot, but there were several whites um, and Jewish people who lived in the area. Um, because they had a lot of covenants on different homes, um, there wasn't, um, there were several blacks, of course, that had finally figured out how to move in. And so when they initially moved in, it was white and black. Then, uh, when I was born, I wasn't the child that my mother was pregnant with when they moved there.
Oh,
She was pregnant with my older brother, who died of SIDS, of infant death.
oh,
Yeah, he died when he was 3 months old, 3 or 4 months old.
oh.
So yeah, about 3 months old. I don't know for sure. So I was born after they had been in the house for a little while, and all I remember is in that area of Los Angeles, in that particular corridor of Jefferson between Arlington and Crenshaw, there was a large migration of people from Louisiana. So I grew up in an area they call Little New Orleans because there was a lot of people from New Orleans, a lot of people from Louisiana. There were several people, lots of people from Texas. And on Jefferson, where I grew up, all of the main stores, the bakery, the cleaners, uh, the where we bought our hot sausage for our gumbo, most stores, oh, the fish market, almost everything was owned by people from Louisiana. So it was like one big happy family. We all knew each other. We all grew up together. We all had families still in Louisiana. And we went to a Catholic school that had mostly, if not, I would say at least 80% of the uh, students there were either born in Louisiana or their parents were from Louisiana and they moved here as a child. So it was mostly Louisiana people, which were black people.
Oh.
Okay, a lot of them were passing for white, but they weren't white. Um, and there were a lot of, you know, blacks from Louisiana and Texas. And so it was pretty much all black people when I was growing up.
Just pretty much all black people. Do you feel like that was? Do you feel that it was primarily black all the way as you were living in that neighborhood?
No.
Oh, do you know when do you feel like there was a shift in the race of people that were living there?
Well, there wasn't a big shift, but there was a small shift of Asians, especially from Japanese Asians. There is an area that's not far from Jefferson Park where you can see the Asian influence because the homes were mostly with Asian
Like the
architecture was Asian. If you know where Leimert Park is,
Yeah.
if you go down certain streets in Leimert Park, you can still see the Asian dominance in a lot of the homes. The architecture, the landscaping, everything. That was about when I was in kindergarten. And the reason I remember that is because the boy across the street from us was Japanese. And I never really knew that there was any real difference in us, you know. But when I look back at my um, kindergarten um, picture, um, they were the majority were Japanese and white, and about 3 blacks.
3 blacks.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting.
Yeah.
This is kind of like I'm gonna backtrack a little bit because I want to ask more. So you had mentioned that your father was in the military and
Yes.
he was in World War II. I wanted to, and I know that you grew up. You grew up during 2 major wars that majorly affected the U.S. So I wanted to ask, from your childhood up until your teenager years, do you feel like you lived in? Do you feel like there were other black soldiers that lived within your neighborhood, or do you feel like you grew up with other black soldiers as well as your father?
Oh yes, all of his best friends were in the Navy, so I grew up with their children,
Oh,
and most of the men who lived in the area were in either the Navy or the Army or something. And we didn't talk about it, but this was the segregated Navy and the segregated Army, and uh, that was, yeah, there was a lot in the area.
and do you feel like throughout your life that you were surrounded by people who were in the military, either be like your personal, your personal peers, as well as people that are associated with your parents?
Yes, because you're right about the 2 wars, because they had the Korean War when I was young, and the Vietnam War when I was a teenager.
Oh.
So I knew a lot of and most of the kids I went to school with, their parents, their father at least, was in the military or some sort of military. My godfather was in the Navy with my father, and all of his best friends, they kind of lived close to where we lived, and I grew up with their kids, and they were all in the Navy. So yeah, and then um, for the Vietnam War, do you want me to go that far?
I You can go as far as eventually. I'm going to ask about your
Okay.
teenage years and your adult years because I want
Okay.
to ask about, but you can go as far as you want to.
Oh, okay. I'll just talk about when I was young. So yeah, they were mostly military people.
All right. So this is more of a loaded question. I wanted to ask because we've already gone over black businesses and people in the military. I wanted to ask through your years, through from probably like when you were a young child through I want to say your teenager, early adult years. This is kind of a 2-parter. Um, what were the professions of the adults that you lived around,
Mm-hmm.
and then as well as do you feel like that held in any way that as well as other social influences influence what you and your peers wanted to do as you grew older?
Oh, okay. Most of them were in the construction industry. Most of them. I would say a large majority of them was in the construction industry. Several were bakers, like they had bakery shops, or they worked for like Helms Bakery. They were in the cooking industry. A lot of them. They a couple of them were either nurses or doctors. Just a couple, just a few at that time. And that some of them worked for the city. Some of them worked for the post office. A lot of them worked for the post office, because when you got out of the service, when you worked for the city or the county or the federal government, you got points. So when you took a test, if you took a test and you just barely made the test, you still had a lot of points because you were in the military. so you would get the job.
Oh, and then so that goes into the next part of the question. So do you feel like that had an effect on what you and your peers wanted to do as you grew up, and as well as what jobs did you guys have as you grew older? Like, what were the jobs of you and other black people that you had been around? What were your jobs like when you guys finally got into the workforce?
Um, well, not too many of us followed what our parents were doing, like working in the post office and working for the cities. We mostly were taught that we needed to go to have a profession.
Oh.
We needed to have to either be doctors, lawyers, something other than what our parents did. However, several of us did go in the construction industry. Several of my close friends who I grew up with, who I'm still close to, our fathers were in construction, so we got in construction, either working in the office or like my brother working actually in the field.
Oh.
And a lot of his friends were in the construction industry working for their fathers.
Mm-hmm. So you guys kind of shifted from what your parents did, but like not totally because it was totally what you wanted to shift from, because they were kind of encouraging to you.
They really didn't. My mother really did not want me to go into construction.
Oh.
No. My mother didn't like it at all. But my father needed a secretary. So I became his secretary and went to college while I was working as his secretary. So I worked pretty much full time as his secretary.
Oh. Do you feel that a lot of black businesses around that time were like black people in careers that they found those jobs or were participating in those jobs because other black people had either invited them or were there?
Well, in my father and all of his friends and his relatives who he grew up with, they were in the construction industry in the Navy, and they were in construction in New Orleans.
Okay.
Yeah, my father, when he was in New Orleans, he worked for the largest black contractor in New Orleans and dated his daughter. So most of them, they were already in the construction industry. Then when they went to the service, they put them in the CBs, which is the construction branch of the Navy.
Oh.
So that was what they knew, and that's what they did.
So what I'm saying is community was a huge part of their early parts in LA, and then end up being a huge part of your early parts of LA.
Correct.
And so I'm gonna shift it a little bit more towards you. So have you lived? So you lived in Jefferson Park for from your early childhood to teens.
Yes.
Have you up until like your adulthood, early to mid adulthood, have you lived anywhere else within Los Angeles?
Not in Los Angeles, but oh yes, I have. But I did spend a lot of time in New Orleans.
Oh.
Yeah, I spent every summer for 3 months. I stayed with my grandmother, my great-grandmother, my aunts, my uncles, my cousins in New Orleans. And then when I wasn't in New Orleans, I was in Springfield, Ohio, with my mother's oldest sister.
Oh, can you give me what the dynamics were like for those? What was it like being in New Orleans as well as being in Ohio? And what do you feel like you have a preference, or not necessarily a preference, but do you what was it like, the difference in those two situations?
Big difference, huge difference. I spent more time in New Orleans, and it was great, but it was I was kind of sheltered um, because my family. I lived in like a they call them projects now.
Yeah.
They weren't called projects then. So I lived in like a housing development place that was, I had almost all of my family, all of my aunts, uncles, my grandmother lived here, my great grandmother lived like, if I could walk from my grandmother's to my great grandmother's in the middle of the court of where they lived. And then I had an auntie and one of my uncles lived close by.
Mm.
And then I had another auntie that lived close. So it was very sheltered. I usually only went to one of their houses, one of their apartments or houses or whatever. I never really saw, the only place I ever went while I was in New Orleans is I would go to Pontchartrain Park. I would go there, but it was segregated, so we had to stay on one side of the park.
Oh.
So my cousin and I, we could go to the other side of the park because we were very light skinned, but my brother was brown skinned, so we had to stay where we had to stay.
Mm.
Okay. And then I also went to St. Aug High School football games. Because see, in Los Angeles, our school started after the school in the South. So I was there during the time when they were starting school.
Oh.
So I would go to the boys. It was an all-boys Catholic school.
Mm.
So I would go to their games with my cousins. So that's pretty much what I knew of New Orleans. I wasn't allowed to go anywhere. Oh, I did go to Auntie Juanita's house because she had a big mansion on the Mississippi. So we did go over there a few times, but to go to anywhere, we couldn't go any place that resembled where tourists went. I wasn't allowed to go across the river, which was a part of the area which they wouldn't allow me to go to.
Oh. So before we get into Ohio, what do you feel like that was a culture shock going to the being in, granted LA has always been racist, but going from non-segregated Los Angeles to deeply segregated New Orleans, was that a culture shock for you? What was that like? That's shit.
No, because remember I grew up with people from New Orleans, where I grew up. So going to New Orleans, being with my family, no, they were the same people. In fact, some of them, their kids would go with us when we would travel. So
would you say that even though legally there was no segregation in LA, you lived in somewhat of a segregated LA?
I lived in a segregated LA, but didn't really realize it.
Oh, okay. And then so then let's shift into what Ohio was like then.
Oh, big difference. Big difference. People from Louisiana are generally, mostly very warm, huggy, kissy people. They hug you a lot, and they laugh a lot, and they had fun, lots of fun. In Springfield, Ohio, they were very reserved. Like my aunt would hug me and my brother, but there wasn't a whole lot of hugging going on. There wasn't a whole lot of, being close or anything. It was a very reserved um, everybody was nice. Everyone that I met were very nice people. Uh, they were mostly black.
Excuse me. Yes.
They were mostly black, um, but most of them were light-skinned blacks. Okay.
Do you feel like you lived a lot of your life around light skinned black people?
Yes. Yeah, a lot. What was interesting though that I wanted to tell you is that when my brother and I were in Springfield, uh, we could only stay on one street. We could only stay on the one street where my aunt and her friends lived on. If we went like just a couple of blocks down and 2 blocks east of where my aunt lived, there was a Ku Klux Klan building. There was a Ku Klux Klan building, and we weren't allowed to go over there. They wouldn't let us go there.
So would you say that they were much more reserved? It was because even though they were not in the South, the racism was more up in their face.
Yeah, I think it was in their face. They knew where their place was. They knew how to act. Even though they were fair skinned, people still knew they were black. So yeah, it was. I didn't realize it until I got older how really scared they were of the white people in the city.
Mm.
They were very scared. Ohio is a very prejudiced place. I think it's still prejudiced to this day. I don't know for sure, but I have spoken to friends of mine who have been there, and they said it wasn't a happy time.
Oh, how long did these I'm gonna go back and forth in terms of like the times of your life. So how long did these trips go on? So how many years of your life did you go on these trips? Like what was the age that you stopped going every summer?
I stopped going every summer when I was 16.
Was there a reason, or did you finally have the choice to not go? Were there any? It just stopped happening.
It just stopped happening.
And then I'm gonna skip a little bit but how many children do you have?
I have 2 biological children, and I have 2 stepsons who I don't refer to as stepsons because I've known them most of their lives.
Do you feel like did you ever send them on any summer trips to the South at all?
Yes, the 2 older boys went to the South several times. Not a lot, but several times. And then I sent my only daughter, 3 sons, 1 daughter. I sent my only daughter to New Orleans by herself. She went there. Oh, her and her brother. We took them to New Orleans a couple of times when they were little, which they don't remember too much. But when my daughter became 13, 14, how old was she? I think 13 or 14. I sent her to be with my cousin. And it was during Mardi Gras.
It was an interesting time.
Which was an interesting time. So she got to go to Mardi Gras with my cousin and her family.
Oh.
Yeah. Which was an experience.
That sounds like an experience.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna bounce back a little bit. So do you feel like before I move on to the next question I have, do you feel like the tradition of sending your children or grandchildren to the South, do you feel like that was a tradition mostly amongst your generation and it slowly died out, or do you feel like that tradition was continuing on, is what I'm saying?
No, the I wish it would have continued. I wish that I was able to send um, my children, all four of them. I wish I was able to send them to go be with grandparents and great grandparents and cousins and uncles and aunts, but we weren't able to. We couldn't afford it by the time that I had children. See, like when we went to New Orleans, we went on the train, and it was inexpensive. It wasn't really that expensive, and uh, there were porters, which I don't know if you do. You know what a Pullman?
I do not know what that is.
Okay, so a Pullman porter was a person on the train, and they were mostly black, and usually we would be on a train with a Pullman porter that was either our relative, our father's best friend, or mother's best friend, or something like that. And so they took care of us, and while we went to New Orleans, they made sure that we were okay, we had fun, and the whole bit, and that we didn't get in trouble. By the time that my children came about, number one, they only had one grandmother there, and the grandmother was in Jackson, Mississippi.
Oh.
So all four of them, their grandmother was in Jackson, Mississippi, and she was raising most of her grandchildren. So we couldn't send our children because she couldn't watch everybody. So, and my cousins, my close cousins, they were raising their family, so I didn't want to burden them with a lot of children to watch. So no, I think that was pretty much the way it was, because most of the people my age, we would go to the South and we would go to the North or wherever to visit our grandparents, our family, our uncles, aunts, cousins, friends. We would go and do that as when we were growing up. But then by the time that we had children, unless we took them, which we ended up doing once or twice, unless we took them, there was no way to send them there to be watched by other family members, because there was nobody to really watch them. They had their own families to watch.
Interesting. So, I wanted to ask this. So, do you, even though Black people, and especially your Black families, even though y'all had less resources, from like before you were born and up to you're born, do you feel like it was easier to connect with your family across different lines, and do you feel like it was easier to, actually let me reframe this, even though Black people at that time had less resources, do you feel like it was easier to connect with your family earlier than it was later, even though y'all had technically gone through college and y'all were supposed to achieve the American dream? Do you feel like it was easier and cheaper to connect with your family before, like in your earlier parts of your life versus later?
Yes. Yeah. We saw our family a lot more. My mother had 12 brothers and sisters. All 12 of them didn't live here. There were 5 of them that lived here, and the rest of them were still in Indiana. But the 5 that lived here, I saw my first cousins all the time. Saw them like at least once or twice a month. And we would get together at their house, and we were very close. And even the ones that kind of lived out, we would go visit them. But as I got older, no, we stopped seeing each other.
Interesting.
I mean, we still see each other. We still talk on the phone, but we're not as close.
do you feel like you had less time to see each other?
Yes, yes, we had less time because, again, um, my cousins were having family, and they were involved in soccer, football, tennis. You know, all of our kids were involved in activities, and so and they were going to different schools. Now, if they had, uh, except for my our youngest son, and our daughter, they were able to go to school with their first cousins. They were able to go to school, and so that part right there um, was somewhat like what I grew up, because I went to school with cousins and friends, and they were able to go. I sent them to Catholic school, and they were able to be in the same Catholic school, even though they weren't in the same grade. They had each other, and they were friends with all of their cousins' friends. So yeah, it was close.
Okay. Can you? So I'm gonna. This is a good shift because I was gonna ask you questions about your adulthood and raising children. So can you name the schools that you had just mentioned and like where they're located?
Sure. I attended, for kindergarten, I attended Sixth Avenue School, which was a block and a half away from where I grew up. It was right there. The area. It was on Jefferson and Sixth Avenue.
You went to the same preschool I went to.
Yes.
So you went to the same preschool as your and
No, there wasn't any preschool then.
well, you went to the same.
I went to kindergarten.
You went to a school similar to same as your grandchildren.
Yeah, it's my grandchildren. Yes.
And then did you? And then was this the case for any of? Was this the case for any of your children? Did they go to any the same school or any schools that were linked to areas that you had grown up in?
Yes. The two older boys went to Holy Name, and which was a Catholic school, and
The school you had gone to?
yes, Holy Name, where I had gone and graduated from, and the two younger children were not allowed to go to Holy Name because at that time you had to go to the Catholic school that was in your area. Each Catholic school has an area. So my children and my nieces had to go to St. Bernadette, which just is a couple of blocks from where I live now. So they could not attend Holy Name. So, but my grandchildren were able to attend Holy Name because by the time that the grandchildren went to school, there was no restrictions of where you go to Catholic school. You could go to any Catholic school, but a lot of the Catholic schools, even though you were allowed to attend any of them, a lot of them would only allow you there if the pastor at your church said it was okay.
Were these Catholics? What was the primary race of these Catholic schools?
When I was little, it was all people from Louisiana and Texas, blacks. When the two older boys went to Holy Name, it was mostly predominantly black. When the two younger children went to St. Bernadette, it was black and white because this area was still had a lot of white people.
What would you say the name of this area is?
Baldwin Hills.
Baldwin Hills around Crenshaw. Or would you include Crenshaw within like that?
Yes.
Okay.
Now my grandchildren, when they went to Holy Name, it was black and Hispanic, I think, or Latinos. So
yeah, it was definitely a lot of that. Well, it was mostly black, but still like
Yeah.
Latinos there.
correct.
I want to. So when you got How did you? So when you got to the point of having children, getting married, and all that, what?
Oh, did you want to know about my other schools I went to?
Um, Actually, we could go into those right now. Then I'll ask my question later.
Okay, so after Holy Name, um, I
And can you say the location of these areas?
sure I went to Notre Dame High School for girls, Catholic high school, which was West LA.
Oh.
Okay, and it was all white.
Oh.
Okay, so I didn't stay there for the whole year. I wasn't able to assimilate, to be like white people. I know a lot of my friends did do that. They went there and they were able to assimilate. I could not. I was definitely more black than white. Um, so I lasted there a
Hold up.
minute.
Can you pause real quick and make sure it's still recording? Yeah, it's still recording. Okay.
Okay, so I lasted there a minute, really a minute, not long at all. And so they sent me to a public school for a junior high for a minute because so I went to Fauché Junior High, which is south. It's southeast. No, it's east. It's east
Oh.
of here. It's on Western Avenue and Exposition.
Oh.
Near.
That is not super far. That is not super far from where you grew up.
No, it's not super far. And that's where I went there for a minute, and then I graduated from there and went to Dorsey. I would not go back to a Catholic school. Refused.
Mm.
I didn't want. I wanted to be myself. I wanted to be, if I wanted to be black, I was black. If I wanted to be white, I'd go there. But so I went to Dorsey. But when I attended Dorsey, there were a lot of whites, and there were a lot of Asians. Very few Latin Hispanics, very few at that time. So it was black, white, and Asian.
Interesting.
But there were more blacks than Asians, but not a whole lot more. If you looked at my yearbook, you would see lots of Asian and white faces.
Interesting. I'm gonna have to. We're almost out of time, so I'm gonna ask.
Okay.
When you moved out of Jefferson Park, because you said that now you live in Baldwin Hills.
Mm-hmm.
What was it? Do you own the house that you currently live in?
Yes.
Do you feel like you had the same issues that your father and mother had previously had when it comes to finding houses, like covenants and
There were covenants, but we didn't. The houses we looked at, there weren't any, because at that time when we moved to Baldwin Hills 48 years ago, there were still whites, there were still a few Jews, but it was gaining more blacks were living in the area.
So you were part of kind of like a mini migration.
Yeah, a mini migration. Yeah.
Okay, and so my last question is, you've spoken a lot about growing up around black people, growing up around people from Louisiana, Texas. Do you feel like your children, the second generation of people from the Great Migration, do you feel like they had a primarily black experience? If I'm not going to assume it was similar to yours, I assume it was different, as all things are. Do you feel like they had a very black experience as you did when they were growing up? Or do you feel like you guys moving created a significant black experience for them?
No, I think that they had a black experience more so.
Oh, more than you?
They had a black experience more than me.
Oh.
Yeah. Even though when we were living here, there was still, whites and other nationalities, but I think that they had more of a black experience. Yes.
Oh, and what years were you raising? Can you give the years that they were born, or at least what years you were raising them?
Okay, so I uh, the older boys, um, Wayne was 10, and no, Wayne was 11, and Todd was 8.
Oh,
So I got them when they were still young, but I knew them before I married their father.
oh.
Okay, so I did know them a couple of years
And what year did
before.
you get married?
We got married in 1974.
Okay. Sorry to cut you off, but continue with your story.
Oh, so, and then we had our youngest son, my oldest biological son. We had him in 1976. Um, and then our daughter was born in 1980.
So this is like, so you'd had, so a lot of your previous experiences that you talked about were like in the 50s, 60s, and the 70s, and then you started raising children around the late 70s, 80s, 90s.
Yeah, the late 70s, from 76.
Yeah.
Well, I had the I had the boys, the older boys, before Anthony was born. So I was around them a lot before Anthony was born. They're Todd is 10 years older than Anthony.
Do you so how do you feel like your experience changed from when you were growing up versus when you started having children and having to experience their world as much as yours?
Yeah, it was different because we raising our children. They saw their first cousins in their family, but they didn't spend as much time with them, like 3 months straight, like me, with my family, and living near them a lot. My daughter and son, they went to school with their first cousins, so they had that experience, but it was much different. It was much, much different. Like when I was growing up, to diverse, when I was growing up, I lived about 10, 12 blocks away from Holy Name, if not further, and I was allowed to walk by myself or with my brother or my friends. We would walk down Jefferson Boulevard.
That's interesting because Dad never let us walk.
No, you couldn't. No, but at that time, because down Jefferson Boulevard, all of our family and our friends, or our parents' friends, owned businesses down Jefferson Boulevard. So we were able to go down Jefferson Boulevard, and nobody would mess with us. By the time that our children, now Wayne and Todd did get to walk to school because they only lived about 3 or 4 blocks away from Holy Name, so they got to walk to school. But when I had Anthony and Missy, they weren't allowed to walk down the street here. We were afraid of people picking them up, and at that time there was a lot of children being abducted. We started putting, if you go back and look at things, we started putting trackers on them.
Trackers. I've heard of tattoos on your children, but not.
No. Trackers that we knew where they were. When we would go to the mall, they would get mad because I put things on them and hold it so that they could.
Also, leashes have been a thing for children long. I thought leashes were a new thing. I didn't know that.
Yeah. Audra's 44 years old, and she wore a leash.
Oh.
Anthony is 48, and he wore a leash.
Was this a common thing amongst Black people?
I think it was amongst people in general. I think that wherever we went, we made sure that we always had them in our sight, because there was a lot of kids disappearing. There was all kinds of, we were afraid that somebody would just shoot them or do something to them. And
Would you say this is around the time when like gangbanging started to make its appearance, and when the crack epidemic started to really?
well, the crack epidemic, sure. The gang thing, there was gangs when I was in high school.
Mm.
There was lots of gangs, but they weren't as treacherous. They weren't as big. You know, the size of them. When I was in high school, um, my brother and his friends were not in gangs, but they would be attacked by gangs.
Mm.
So they kind of formed a crew of friends. They weren't a gang. They didn't call themselves Crips or Bloods or anything like that, but they stayed together for protection. And one night we went to a party, and while we were at the party, I don't know if it was the Crips or the Bloods, I can't tell you which one, but one of the gangs came to attack the party. And my future sister-in-law and I were thrown in a closet and told to stay there and don't move. And there was a lot of gunshots and stuff going on around us. I had never been in a gang situation, never. And that's when I was in high school.
Oh, what year was that?
That was 66, 67.
So this is kind of like this is like the eve. This is like before the real this is kind of like the eve of like when certain Blood and Crip gangs started to like show up. Like this is right before they started to show up. Like this is right before the.
Well, I can't tell you exactly, but they were there.
They were there. Oh,
they were there. And I don't know which one it was. I can't tell you.
Yeah.
Like I said, my brother didn't belong to a gang, but he had a group of friends that I think they might have called themselves some sort of gang, but they weren't with the Crips or the Bloods. They were just in a crew. They just stayed together to protect each other.
Interesting.
So, and that's high school.
All right, I'm going to end this right here. It is currently 2:14. Thank you so much. Can you state your name again?
Audrey Ina Shaw.
And I forgot to say my name earlier, but I am David Cofield, and thank you so much.
You're welcome. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for asking.